So at this time, I want to turn it over to Jean Peters Baker, who is the prosecuting attorney in Jackson County, Missouri, probably better known as Kansas City, Missouri, very high crime jurisdiction. Jean has done many innovative things in her office. We have invited her many times for different topics, but today she is here to speak about her approach to bringing in the community, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Chris. And it's good to see everyone today. It's nice to be in a room where prosecutors are always seeking new ways to do our very old business. So I'm one of those prosecutors who think we should lean into this era of change and find ways to manage public safety with a greater voice in our community from all members of our community. So that's probably what this community board is for me. So let me start out a little bit by telling you who I am. I'm Jean, please call me Jean. I'm the prosecutor for Jackson County, Missouri. My largest jurisdiction is Kansas City. There's a part of Kansas City is on the Kansas side. I'm on the Missouri side. Some people really, that's a really big deal. State line is just really a road, but not really over here. It's kind of a big deal. So we joke a lot with our neighbors over in Kansas. They're good partners to us. But my jurisdiction is complex. It's complex, like a lot of prosecutors' own jurisdictions, because it engages parts of a more bedroom community, suburban communities, and even a little bit of rural. I have some farmland even in my community. So we are a jurisdiction that has about 22 police agencies under it. Like I said, my biggest is Kansas City, Missouri, which is a police force of about 1,500 sworn, or they claim the number's a lot lower than that now. But anywho, it's a pretty large police department. Kansas City ranks 6th in the nation as the most violent city, 6th in the nation. So we're not proud of that, but it's also something I don't hide from. It's such an issue in my beautiful Midwestern town that it's something that I feel like I have to address. So we are under 1 million in population, and I have probably not quite 75 prosecutors. That's probably my best day. I have 75. It's a constant thing to remain fully staffed. So though I have a lot of complexities in my jurisdiction, my community board really does just focus on my urban core community. It was too difficult to try and come up with a board that covered the entire county. And I wanted to really focus in on issues that were really germane to issues of violence, poverty, and all of those other issues, over policing, over prosecution in certain areas of my jurisdiction. So I wanted to focus on that one spot, which is the largest spot of my community. So we have talked about expanding my community board. So I had a whole second community board that would be for those more suburban parts of my community that have just frankly very, very different issues and different policing concerns. But my community is largely, my community advisory board largely addresses what happens in my urban core. It's made up of about 9 members. This is just now the second community advisory board that I have used. And for me, it was a little bit of a, well, let's just try this and see if it works, because we should seek a voice that is very different than our own. We should try and get out of our prosecutor heads and try and serve the community as closely as we can. And that means we need to hear from them. So to give you a flavor of what my community board looks like, it is a multidisciplinary team of people. We try to bring in people that have different levels of expertise in different areas. One of those individuals, however, is an individual that has served well over 20 years for a crime that he didn't commit. He was convicted out of my jurisdiction. And there was a period of time where I too reviewed his case, and we were on opposite sides, of how his case should be handled. He serves on this board because he has such a important voice in not just wrongful convictions, but a much wider scope than that, to help me understand and my staff to understand the impacts that we can make and how we can make a more positive change in our own office. So he's just one community member, one community advisory board member. And like I said, there are 9 in total. We have someone that has a role as he is a business owner, but he also was struck by crime personally. His grandson were killed along with his grandson was shot and wounded, and that grandson's father also died. And so he had a real important connection to my office through serving as a victim, that nobody wants that title. But those are just the types of focuses that we bring in so that we can talk to people who have different points of view. This time, I thought it was important to try and gain members that even had a less favorable view of the prosecutor, so that we were making sure that we were getting dissent. I wanted people that didn't feel like they had to come in and champion the prosecutor in any way, but they would be honest with us. They would really utilize the seat that we were offering to them, and they wouldn't hold back in their critique. That can be hard. We're in a high critique business, so you only have to read your local newspaper if you want to see how we're in a high critique business. But it's really important for us to hear those voices so that we are bending our practices in a way that better serves all aspects of the community. So we also have a community board member that represents sort of that LGBTQ victim in my community, and issues that go along that we should know about, that we should be more in tune to, and how that community in particular is being policed, and how they are sometimes not listened to when it comes to my office. So some of the last community board, one of the big cases that we really focused on, not cases, but big areas of interest that we focused on, was a new drug policy. So I brought to them a lot of data, and what I was looking for was just trying to better inform them as I was better informing myself of what kind of drug cases I was spending my time on, what kind of outcomes I were getting on those drug cases, what the racial makeup looked like, the geography looked like, because we have some real geography issues in Kansas City, and what we should do about it. So the community board gave a lot of advice throughout of what additional data they wanted to see, what we could pull from our own data, what we could pull from police data. And then I started cultivating a new policy regarding drug enforcement. So we launched, I guess it was, I'm going to lose track of time, maybe late last year, we launched a new drug policy that included, the chance for a drug case to get filed, but it had to meet some pretty significant criteria. That criteria included a violence nexus, with a pretty broad definition of what violence was, but it also included the possibility of a case to be filed through a neighborhood nuisance or a neighborhood concern that brought that case to police. What I was trying to bend, of course, was the large racial inequities that were found in my drug prosecutions and how those cases came to the door to me. And, to kind of think about how that history of drug prosecution left a probably greater gap between a community that I'm really trying to reach and my own office in trust. So I think, the trust gap really only widened with that, with the type of drug policy that pretty much looked at whatever came through the door. If the police brought it through the door, then it was my job to prosecute it. And we really wanted to have a much deeper, thorough understanding of a drug case. And we wanted to have a much deeper understanding of how those cases were impacting my community. So what I found, mostly with that community board's advice and counsel to me of what they wanted to see, was about 25% of all the drug cases that I filed, which was a lot, a lot of drug cases. It was the single largest category of case filed by my office. Only about 25% had any kind of nexus to violence. So for the long-term prosecutor like myself, that felt wrong, because as we all have been taught, drugs equal violence. If you wait long enough, it will always show up. And then when you really start digging into the data, at least with the drug cases I received, that was not the case. It simply wasn't true. It may be we've been taught something different, but it didn't show up in the data. So that was what was really important. Plus the racial inequities were gross. There's no other way to explain it, but they were really gross. And it required, once you gain a higher degree of knowledge, it requires thoughtful change and leadership to institute those changes. So the picture that you have here is me with some members of our community board. Some of them were still virtual, meeting with us online, and we're just sort of walking through some new data that we had and where we go next. What are the next things that we want to do with this community board? And one of those focuses that I use for this community board is for the community to help advise me on what other areas that they want me to have a better understanding of on police use of force cases. So before I would review a use of force case, I wanted to know, what other things should I be asking? What other answers should I try and gain for the community, whether I file that case or I decline it? What does the community want to know? And their point of view is quite different from someone who always looks at something just through a legal prism. And so it's really important. These are community cases. They're not just a legal case. They're cases that really matter to my community as a whole. So there are times where we will go into closed session, even though we post our agenda, it's all made public. We follow my state sunshine rules on how to go about having a public meeting. The news media is allowed in if they want to come. Like, that's where this slide came from, was that news media was able to come in and listen to what we were doing. But we do have the ability to go into closed session to allow us to deal with certain issues that maybe are not appropriate for public dissemination at that point. And while I am close to those investigations, I realize that we have to walk a fine line in presenting certain information, even to a community advisory board. So that means sometimes I have to go into hypotheticals so that we can better gain an understanding of how I can handle a particular case, what information I can gain from it, and what additional questions I should ask of my investigative team, so I can have a better understanding of the case from a community perspective as well. So that's kind of how we go about it. I think what's important to me is that we have a voice of dissent, real dissent, on my community board, that we're seeking people with different points of view, different opinions, and that they're willing to really lean in and provide that kind of information to me in my office. We want to do a better job of bringing community into some of our policy making, and because this is what impacts them, and we can make better policy if we're hearing from them. So those are, I guess, what I would say some of the lessons that I've personally learned from my community board, is that they have a very astute sense of community, and I am their steward. I am serving for them, and so it's important for me to be able to carry their voice through not just the cases that I carry, but the type of policy that I imbue into my office. They've really, probably without them, I wouldn't have nearly as well-informed drug policy, which here's the difference in drug policy. Probably from that one police department, I had about 1,400 felony drug cases that came through the door every single year. And now that's probably much closer to about 400. So it's significant. It's a significant change. And it frees up some significant resources in my office, so I can shift prosecutors to more of a violence perspective than just the grind of drug cases that we were doing a pretty poor job handling throughout the court process anyway. And so for me, the benefit is I get to use my resources more effectively that benefit my community in ways that I had very clue about earlier. The most recent—
Jean, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Can.
Yeah, how did you change your criteria to go from 1,400 to 400? What was it that made the difference that they gave? What insight did they give you?
So first of all, we start looking at the racial inequities and geography. Most geography in my city will also explain racial inequities. And so we dug pretty deeply into that. And then we started looking at my outcomes on drug cases, like how well I were faring, which was pretty pathetic, honestly. I could talk a lot about the police and why they brought me certain cases, but I'd rather focus on myself and how poorly we were handling those drug cases. And so we just started looking at, if this is how poor we're faring, maybe we can have a connection at the community level, getting someone treatment rather than filing a criminal case, the delay of time, and feathering that case out over a period of years, rather than using the intervention of the criminal justice system simply to give treatment.
So they were diverted to treatment early on in the process, and maybe even before charging?
Almost always before charging. So now it requires that there's some kind of nexus to violence to get that case filed, or there's a demonstrated community concern, community nuisance kind of issue that we want to be mindful of, because people do not want to live in a neighborhood where a drug dealer has set up on the block and has a very active house. So I'm very mindful of that as well, that my job is twofold. It is to protect public safety, but it is to do so with policy in mind and to make sure that we're really thinking about that policy.
Thank you.
So the last piece I'll offer and hang it up here, but the last piece is simply that my community board has said, it's time for you to start sharing in a much greater way the type of work that your office is doing. And that, they were surprised to learn some of the policies and training that we have in my office. And so their goal is to help me figure out how to have a much greater social media presence to address all that the office does, which is a different kind of world for me to be in, because as prosecutors, we just don't do a lot of social media, almost none. We talk about a case that is filed, or maybe a conviction, but that's it. So they want me to have a much greater community voice. So we're working on that now to figure out how to achieve that.
This is Sophia Roach. Prosecutor Peters Baker, could you talk a little bit about some of the economic information that you discovered in your review of the data, especially as it pertained to your drug cases, vis-a-vis costs of diversion and treatment?
Yeah, I sure can. So for everyone on this call, right, there's the national data shows that a single drug case cost about $146,000 from beginning to end. That means from the initial intervention by police to prosecutor through the court system, and maybe that includes probation and parole or some level of incarceration. That is probably a pretty understated cost for most all of us. It was very difficult for me to glean what my actual costs are in Jackson County. I tried, but we couldn't glean that cost with much credibility. So I stick with that national number. But it's important for everyone to know this is not free. It is not free. It's not just your prosecutor's time, but it's police time and courts time, sheriffs, jail, probation officers, and then think about the harm that drug case can potentially do at a community level when someone's real issue is that they're an addict. So my system just simply is not very good at handling an addict. That shouldn't be shocking. but it is to some. And so just because we've always done it doesn't mean we have to keep doing it. I would rather addicts get treatment. And I would rather that a prosecutor is spending their time on a case that really does have a much greater impact on a community, like an act of violence.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. That was a very helpful sort of explanation of both your thinking and the outcomes of your community advisory boards.